If you've struggled with weight gain and worsening poor health on a high-fat carnivore or other high-fat, low-carb diets, you may have hoped that the other popular way of eating, the high-carb, low-fat, plant-based way of eating, would finally be the answer. And for some people, it is. It really does work. People lose weight on it and they reverse health problems. It's worked. It's done its job to correct your gut, and there's absolutely no need to change anything. But the truth is, everyone is different. If you're over 40, approaching midlife or menopause, or if you have a long history of yo-yo dieting, you're likely dealing with deeper leptin and therefore a more compromised gut immune system. These people need something that is even more strategic, something that is even more effective to correct the failing gut environment that is causing all your weight and health problems. Neither high-fat, low-carb or high-carb, low-fat, plant-based may be enough to fully correct what's going on underneath. You may have started to feel hopeless that there is any chance of ever correcting the food noise which is causing you to overeat and making it almost impossible to lose weight. You may have started to think that GLP-1 meds may be the only hope for you. I know I have certainly been at that point myself, but developing a better understanding of the scientific mechanisms which control body fat, it started to dawn on me that there is another option, one which has been around for years but I've always overlooked. So it made sense in terms of the mechanisms. So I decided to try it, and honestly, it's blown me away. The difference with this strategy compared to both high-carb, low-fat and high-fat, low-carb is night and day in terms of reducing my food noise, which has always been my main problem when it comes to trying to lose weight. It honestly feels as powerful for reducing my food noise as the GLP-1 meds, which I have tried in the past. So what is it? What is this holy grail macronutrient ratio? The one I've been trying to find all these years. It is, like the high-carb, low-fat diet, a low-fat diet. But instead of being high-carb, low-fat, instead it is high-protein, low-fat. You don't combine high carbs and high protein with low fat. You swap the carbohydrates for protein. When protein goes up, carbohydrates must come down. And really thinking about this way of eating and the science behind it, I started to realize that there are actually a ton of benefits about this way of eating compared to either a strict high-carb, low-fat diet or a strict high-fat, low-carb diet. This way of eating is so corrective to the gut environment. You can actually get away with having more carbohydrates or more fats at one of your meals a day. That flexibility makes this way of eating more enjoyable, more varied, less restrictive, less prone to inducing subclinical deficiencies, and ultimately far more doable and long-term sustainable, which is, of course, extremely important for long-term success. And it's inclusive. You can do this animal-based or plant-based or a combination of both. You just have to find lean protein sources, either animal-based or plant-based, that you can rely on for most of your food throughout the day, with your evening meal being more flexible. In this video, I'm going to show you the science, which explains why this way of eating is superior for people with more deep leptin resistance. And I'm also going to present to you the many advantages of this way of eating compared to strict high-fat, low-carb or strict high-carb, low-fat, plant-based. So let's break it down. To understand why this is the optimal macro ratio for fat loss, it is important to understand the actual mechanisms which control the amount of fat we have on our body, not the old internet myths and guru guesswork. The new science is revealing that it is failures in the gut which induce excess weight gain and poor health. And specifically, obesity and poor health is caused by high levels of bacteria and high levels of bile in the gut. When you have high levels of bad bacteria and high levels of bile, the bile gets damaged by the bacteria, which creates a type of toxic bile. This bile is toxic because it blocks the secretion of the most important anti-obesity hormone, GLP-1. The GLP-1 hormone is secreted by the gut. It is the hormone which is responsible for keeping you lean and healthy. And it is a deficiency of this hormone which is responsible for all your struggles with your weight and metabolic health. So this toxic bile created when bad bacteria damage bile is the worst culprit for blocking your GLP-1 secretion by your gut. But high levels of bacteria can also block GLP-1 by themselves, even in the absence of bile. For example, this 2025 peer-reviewed study published in Nature Metabolism found that the intestinal bacterium disulfovibrio produces hydrogen sulfide in the gut. This hydrogen sulfide impairs the function of the gut L cells, the cells that make the GLP-1. And as a result, GLP-1 secretion is reduced in male mice with higher levels of these bacteria. Importantly, blocking disulfovibrio or hydrogen sulfide production improved GLP-1 levels and metabolic outcomes in the mouse model. And this 2023 study published in the journal Gut Microbes found that problem bacteria in the gut reduces GLP-1 via altering the bile, i.e. making it toxic. And there are plenty more studies which support this mechanism. All of the different diets which have been found to help people lose weight and correct their health work to varying extents and in different ways because they are either reducing levels of the problem bacteria or levels of bile in the gut. That is how and why those diets work. It is high levels of toxic bile and bad bacteria that is the cause of the GLP-1 deficiency, which drives weight gain and poor health. A high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, like carnivore or moderate protein keto diets, has many reports of outstanding success for many people in helping them lose weight and improve their health. And this works really well for many people at first. The reason this strategy works so well for so many people at first, although it must be mentioned not everyone, is because when you cut carbohydrates in the diet to very low levels, this deprives the problem bacteria in the gut of their essential fuel, carbohydrates. Cutting carbohydrates in the diet to lose weight is similar to reducing dietary sugar to reduce levels of the decay-causing bacteria in the mouth. That is because the decay-causing bacteria depend on sugars and refined starches for their growth. When we cut those foods out, we reduce the levels of problem bacteria in our mouth, which reduces the incidence of decay. And the same thing happens when we cut carbohydrates in the diet. The levels of those problem bacteria in the gut, which rely on dietary carbohydrates, fall to low levels in the gut. This reduces the amount of toxic bile because of the low levels of problem bacteria, and as a result also a reduction in levels of toxic bile. Proper GLP-1 release by the gut is restored, which then gets to work repairing health and allowing the body to lose excess body fat. And because this gets levels of problem bacteria so low, the bile that gets released in response to eating fat doesn't get damaged by problem bacteria. This type of bile does not become toxic. It does not block GLP-1 release by the gut. In fact, this type of bile is actually metabolically helpful. So this is why at first, when a low-carbohydrate diet is so effective to get levels of bacteria low, you can get away with eating a high-fat diet. However, this happy golden time, where the only thing you have to worry about is cutting carbohydrates and you can eat high-fat freely, does not last forever for many people. And for some people, it doesn't happen at all. This is all to do with how effective cutting carbohydrates is to actually get levels of bacteria sufficiently low to allow having lots of fat and therefore lots of bile in the gut. Studies show that by 6 months, the problem gut bacteria have started to adapt and become better able to thrive even in the absence of carbohydrates. At that point, even protein can be a sufficient stimulus to fuel higher levels of problem bacteria. And when that happens and levels of bacteria are not sufficiently low, and you combine that with a high-fat diet which induces more bile in the gut, you run the risk of creating too much toxic bile. And at that point, for many people, the high-fat diet actually starts making them gain weight. Poor health symptoms start to reappear. The high-fat diet has stopped working because just cutting carbohydrates has stopped being sufficient to get levels of problem bacteria sufficiently low. For some people, this happens after 6 months, and for others with a weaker gut immune system, a high-fat carnivore or high-fat low-carb diet might not even work right from the beginning. If your high-fat carbohydrate diet stops working, at this point you have two options to avoid creating the toxic GLP-1 blocking bile in the gut. The first option is to start to cut protein as well as carbohydrates. If you can get protein low enough to get levels of problem bacteria sufficiently low, you can continue to tolerate a high-fat, high-bile diet. And this is what some long-time low-carbohydrate influencers do, e.g. Kelly Hogan and Stephanie Keto Person, are both fans of a low-protein, high-fat diet. They find that they are able to keep the excess weight off and be seemingly healthy eating this way. However, I do believe that this strategy is more effective later in a low-carbohydrate journey and more as something done intermittently for various reasons which I will discuss. So, is there another option available to us? Instead of having to keep cutting protein even lower, there is another option which we can use to get levels of the toxic GLP-1 blocking bile reduced. The other option we can use when a low-carbohydrate diet has stopped being as effective to get levels of problem bacteria sufficiently low is to target the bile instead. Instead of trying to get levels of bacteria extremely low to avoid the formation of toxic bile, instead we can try to get levels of bile sufficiently low. And how can we reduce levels of bile in the gut? We can reduce the amount of fat in the diet. This is because it is fat that is the trigger for bile release into the gut. Therefore, a low-fat diet is an alternative strategy to reducing the amount of toxic bile in the gut. This is where many people struggling with weight gain and worsening health on high-fat carnivore or other high-fat low-carbohydrate diets, having noticed people reporting health improvements and weight loss on low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets, decide to jump to the high-carb, low-fat diet instead. And having noticed that these high-carb, low-fat diets tend to be more effective when they are also plant-based, this is where a lot of low-carb refugees end up, the high-carb, low-fat, plant-based diet. The success of these types of diets is due in large part to the low-fat element of these diets. But there is an additional benefit of going plant-based as well on a high-carbohydrate diet. It is because if you are not putting starvation pressure on bad bacteria by eating a low-carbohydrate diet, it helps to put starvation pressure on the problem bacteria by restricting sulfur-based proteins instead. This is because the problem bacteria require both sulfur-based proteins and carbohydrates to be able to thrive and grow. If just one is restricted, it limits their growth and abundance in the gut. So if you are doing a high carbohydrate diet, you want to be putting that starvation pressure on the bacteria by reducing sulfur-based proteins. And it is animal proteins which are richest in sulfur-based proteins. Whereas on a low carbohydrate diet, because you are already putting starvation pressure on the bacteria by eating low carbohydrates, you can be more free and easy with the sulfur-based proteins, i.e. the animal proteins, up to a point. And many people do find that they do get everything they want from this way of eating. They reverse their health problems and lose some weight. However, some people find that their health and weight loss goals still elude them. They find that they are still struggling with food noise and hunger. Their weight loss stalls still a long way above where they want to be, and some health problems may still persist. And this scenario is more likely for those of us entering middle age and those of us with long histories of yo-yo dieting. This is because these factors weaken the strength of the gut immune system. So we need to be even more strategic with our diet to be able to sufficiently correct our GLP-1. When even a high-carbohydrate, low-fat, plant-based diet is still not enough to get you to your health and weight loss goals, you may begin to feel hopeless. You may begin to think that GLP-1 meds are your only hope. of ever becoming free of the food noise, which is preventing you from reaching your goal weight. I've certainly been at this point myself. But wait, there is one macro ratio option left. Another option, the road lesser travelled, although I am certainly not the first. I knew that a very low-fat diet could help a lot by reducing levels of bile in the gut. But finally it dawned on me that I don't have to do a high carbohydrate diet to do a low-fat diet. I could instead protein low-fat diet. Again, we are not combining high protein with high carbohydrate. We are swapping out the carbohydrates for protein. Remember, we don't want to be combining carbohydrates and proteins. We want to be restricting sulfur-based proteins or carbohydrates to ensure that we are able to limit the growth of the problem bacteria. It is a high-protein, low-fat diet, as opposed to a high-carbohydrate, low-fat diet. We are starving the problem bacteria of carbohydrates instead of sulfur-based proteins, i.e. animal proteins. But why would starving the bacteria of carbohydrates instead of sulfur-based proteins actually be a better strategy for some people, and especially for weight loss? Well, there are several reasons. Firstly, it is practically easier and more achievable to limit carbohydrates sufficiently compared to trying to get levels of sulfur-based proteins sufficiently low. There are proteins present even in high carbohydrate foods, and it is actually quite difficult to get levels of sulfur-based proteins sufficiently low, even on a high-starch, plant-based diet. Although for some people with a stronger gut immune system, it may be quite achievable. The second reason that I believe that restricting carbohydrates instead of restricting protein gets better results for many people, and this is the most important reason, is because carbohydrates are a much more potent fuel than protein for the growth and proliferation of the problem bacteria. In a study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2021, researchers analyzed how long-term dietary intake of different nutrients associated with the gut microbiota composition. The authors concluded that carbohydrates are the preferred energy source for the gut microbiome, and that carbohydrate intake in particular drives negative changes to the gut microbiota composition, more than dietary protein or fiber. The researchers found that a high-carbohydrate diet decreased bacteria which have been found to induce health and leanness, whilst increasing dialister and desulfovibrio bacteria, bacteria which have been found to induce and are strongly associated with insulin resistance, poor health, and obesity. The authors in this study state that the problem bacteria desulfovibrio use many carbohydrates as fuel for their growth and survival, such as glucose and fructose, and they conclude, our findings of the positive association of the linear increase in carbohydrate intake with desulfovibrio is that the persistently high carbohydrate intake afforded desulfovibrio a continuous supply of substrate and subsequent increase in abundance. They are saying that a high intake of dietary carbohydrates provides a continuous supply of fuel for the growth and proliferation of this problem bacteria in the gut. And this was in agreement with the findings of a recent review and a large study that showed that the intake of carbohydrates is the largest dietary predictor of gut bacterial diversity, i.e., a higher intake of dietary carbohydrates leads to worse bacterial diversity. And this matters because high bacterial diversity is the hallmark of the gut microbiome that promotes leanness and optimal health. Therefore, when we do a high-protein, low-carbohydrate diet, this reduces levels of problem bacteria in the gut more than a high-carbohydrate, low-protein diet. And this is clearly superior when it comes to getting levels of the problem bacteria reduced in the gut, which is our ultimate aim if we are to correct obesity and poor health. And getting levels of problem bacteria sufficiently low doesn't just increase GLP-1 secretion, thereby reducing obesity and other poor metabolic health symptoms. Getting levels of problem bacteria lower has other benefits for both physical and mental in terms of reversing poor health symptoms, which are induced by high levels of problem bacteria via other mechanisms, such as some types of irritable bowel syndrome, depression and other psychiatric health disorders, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, etc. And the third reason that I believe a high-protein, low-carb, low-fat diet is better than a high-carb, low-fat diet is the fact that it means that you can tolerate a bit more fat in the diet, because lower levels of bacteria, which damage the bile, mean that you can tolerate higher levels of bile in the gut. Although we are restricting dietary fat, we don't have to be quite as strict with fat as you do on a high carbohydrate diet. I even find that as long as I eat fairly lean for most of the day, that I can be quite a bit more liberal with fat at one meal a day. This is beneficial because you reduce the risk of running into subclinical fat deficiencies. Although this is debatable, there are people who swear that they notice some negative symptoms from being super low fat all the time. And besides that, eating a bit more fat is more enjoyable. When I was doing a high carb, very low fat diet, I personally did miss eating higher fat foods sometimes. And the other benefit of being able to tolerate more fat is the fact that some higher fat foods are extremely nutritious, such as eggs. Eggs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet, and most of that nutrition is in the yolk, which is the fattier part of the egg. So having that bit more tolerance for fat means that we can get away with eating those foods which are a little more fatty and may have a lot more nutrition, such as eggs. And because you are already starving problem bacteria with a low carbohydrate diet, you don't have to use sulfur-based protein restriction to keep levels of problem bacteria low as well. This means that you have better tolerance for sulfur-based proteins, i.e., you have better tolerance for animal proteins. And for many, this is a welcome thing, because it increases the variety of what you can eat. Being able to include more fat and protein in the diet also greatly improves the nutritional value of the diet. Protein foods do contain a lot more nutritional value than starches, and this is true for both plant-based and animal-based proteins. Beef, for example, is like a multi-nutrient super supplement. It is rich in B12, B6, niacin, iron, zinc, selenium, creatine, carnosine, and taurine. And eggs are rich in B12, vitamin D, vitamin A, choline, selenium, iodine, lutein, and zeaxanthin. I do believe there is a greater risk of developing subclinical deficiencies on a completely plant-based diet, and especially on low-protein plant-based diets. Although you may get away with it with judicious supplementation, such as taking collagen supplements or beef liver capsules, to ensure you're getting all your micronutrient needs. In my own N=1 experience, I did feel as though my skin seemed to be aging faster when I was eating higher carb, low-fat plant-based. This could be a coincidence, but it was noticeable. And now on this high-protein, low-carb version of a low-fat diet, my skin is looking noticeably better. My skin seems a lot more plumped up and elastic, whereas before it seemed to be really sagging and grey. I even feel as though my grey hairs are coming in more slowly as well. Again, it could be a coincidence, but it is noticeable. And the third benefit of this higher protein version of a low-fat diet is that many of us approaching or in the depths of middle age are trying to build muscle to prevent age-induced muscle wasting. Although very low protein diets have been found to prevent muscle wasting by activating FGF21, it is unlikely that they are optimal for muscle building. And the fourth additional benefit of the high-protein, low-carb version of a low-fat diet is that protein induces greater diet-induced thermogenesis. We know that when we eat protein, 30% of the calories from that protein food get burned off just in the process of digesting and metabolizing it. Protein is more metabolically expensive than either carbohydrates or fats. So if we ate 480 calories of protein, we would burn 140 calories just in the process of metabolizing it. And this would certainly add up a lot over time. And the fifth benefit is that outside of very low protein diet contexts, protein is more satiating than carbohydrates. With protein restriction diets like the sugar diet, the rice diet, the starch solution, fat fasting or fruit fasting. It can take as long as 2 weeks for the problem bacteria to get sufficiently starved by the protein restriction. That means it can take as long as 2 weeks before that diet will actually start to reduce your food noise and your food cravings and your appetite. And in the absence of protein, it can mean that you end up feeling very hungry during this stage. It can be quite an agonizing food craving-filled period that for many is so difficult that they can't even get through it. Often they will be so hungry and filled with intense cravings that they will end up binging on high-carb, high-fat, high-protein junk foods, which prevents them from sticking to the rules long enough to get to the other side, where it actually starts to reduce the appetite. This long adaptation period can make it very difficult for people to ever actually get to the point where they get the benefits of the appetite suppression. In contrast, when you go straight to a high-protein, low-carb, low-fat diet, eating mainly lean protein, you instantly get the highest satiety benefit of eating higher protein. And this makes it a lot easier to stick to. It makes it a lot easier to actually reduce carbohydrates in the first place because the protein is supporting your satiety. And this isn't just based on N=1 observations. Many studies show that protein is more satiating than carbohydrates outside of very low protein diet contexts. In multiple controlled feeding studies, energy-matched high-protein preloads suppressed appetite and reduced food intake more than high-carbohydrate preload, demonstrating that protein is more satiating than carbohydrates, outside of those very specific cases of protein restriction studies, such as the rice diet, the sugar diet, etc. And the reason that protein is more satiating than carbohydrates outside of those contexts is because protein stimulates the satiety hormones like PYY and GLP-1 more strongly than carbohydrates. This has been found in multiple studies. It appears that the main problem you might have with a higher protein intake is constipation, and this can be alleviated with psyllium husk and inulin fiber, or just pairing your lean protein with more fibrous vegetables. So, this way of eating overcomes the first biggest obstacle to weight loss: food noise and overeating. It shuts down food noise and makes it possible for us to actually create a calorie deficit. However, once you have solved the food noise problem, there is another problem, the next problem which dieters face. This is the problem of metabolic adaptation, and it occurs in response to a chronic calorie deficit, especially a calorie deficit which is too big. This is a very real thing. It does happen. I've seen it happen repeatedly to dedicated dieters. They may have fixed their leptin resistance and their food noise, and their health may have improved in multiple ways. But a chronic calorie deficit, and especially a calorie deficit that is too big, can and will reduce the metabolic rate and energy expenditure to a point that that calorie deficit stops being a calorie deficit. The calorie deficit becomes your new maintenance calories. And this is when you hit a stall or a plateau. And this can persist for weeks and months, even though you're eating at what you thought was a calorie deficit. Any long-time yo-yo dieter will be more than familiar with this. When this happens, some bad gurus might tell you to keep cutting your calories. Now that your metabolic rate and energy expenditure has dropped, you're going to have to cut calories even lower to create another calorie deficit. However, this is not healthy, especially when you get below around 1,200 calories a day. When calories get too low for too long and energy rationing gets enacted throughout the body, this can start to affect health systems in the body and not getting enough energy to perform their functions optimally. And therefore, poor health symptoms start to appear, such as hair loss, prematurely aging skin, irritable bowel syndrome, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and fatigue, amongst other symptoms. So, when you find weight loss starting to plateau, instead of just trying to cut calories even more, putting you in the danger zone for poor health symptoms, this is when it's time to use strategies to boost your metabolic rate and energy expenditure back up. You need to increase your metabolism again, to the point that the calorie deficit becomes a deficit again. In my next video, I'll be showing you the evidence for strategies which work to boost metabolism back up when weight loss stalls or plateaus, and these are essential tools to enable you to actually get to your goal weight. It's not enough to just correct your GLP-1 and your leptin resistance. You also need to know how to prevent low-calorie induced metabolic adaptation. Please do subscribe to make sure you don't miss that one. Thank you for listening, and hopefully see you in the next one.